Creator in Conversation presents Steve Ditko, Beyond the Myth. Part 1, Mysterious Travellers. No one actively involved was seeking to establish a coherent explanation, a valid whole for the numerous parts. Too many people just kept dumping their impossible to prove verbiage, their mental trash. Welcome to Steve Ditko, Beyond the Myth, a special 3-part miniseries with the Creator in Conversation podcast. In this episode, we are joined by the author of Mysterious Travellers by Dr. Zack Kruse, Steve Ditko and the Search for a New Liberal Identity. Dr. Kruse joins us to discuss the terms of Steve Ditko's career within academia. And when I say academia, I don't imply that we're looking at it in a microscopic, inaccessible approach. We're looking at it from the point of view of Steve Ditko as a creator, as an artist. What he put on the page he did with deliberate intent. There was, in recent years, a lot of misclassification of the characters he developed, such as Doctor Strange, who he created and who was originally depicted as an Asian character, but much later became Dr. Stephen Strange, a much more anglicised, whitewashed character, as it were. Also, we dispelled, not just in this episode, but in upcoming episodes as well, some of the myths associated with Steve Ditko. To the world at large, Steve Ditko has been presented as an individual who was a recluse to the world, who fell out with other creators because of creative decisions. What you will learn within this miniseries is that Steve Ditko was not falling out with individuals over creative decisions. He was in fact the one steering a lot of the stories, if not the entirety of the stories, particularly in the case of Spider-Man. These were his decisions, his stories, his plot, and there's a lot to be said around that of the creator. At the start of this episode, you heard me read an extract, a quote from Steve Ditko himself. It was taken from a mini-history, Some Background, written by Steve Ditko in 2001. It's part of 16 mini-essays that he wrote in regards to the creation of Spider-Man and his time at Marvel as well. In each episode, the start of each episode for this 3-part mini-series, you will hear me again begin with the words of Steve Ditko himself. The reason for this is because this podcast and this mini-series, in a way, is a paradox. Steve Ditko very rarely spoke openly about his work per se. He did write a lot of essays, he did have correspondence, he was accessible, as you will learn. The myth of him being a recluse was overstated, to say the least. But he was a firm believer in that the work should speak for itself. However, as you heard from the opening quote, no one actively involved was seeking to establish a coherent explanation, speaks towards the lack of exploration in terms of what was the truth surrounding his work, what was the actual intent, and what was the truth to the real happening of how things developed. For this reason, our first guest in today's episode, Dr. Zack Kruse, was a brilliant place to start. His text, Mysterious Travellers, really helped me individually reevaluate and review the work of Steve Ditko. And as we discuss, the text as a whole is very accessible to people. If you wish to pick up a copy, I highly recommend. It will further enrich your understanding and appreciation of the work of Steve Ditko. And so now, over to our first guest in this 3-part mini-series, Dr. Zack Kruse. Welcome, Dr. Kruse, to Creator in Conversation, and thank you for joining us today. I was first came aware of your book, Mysterious Travellers, for your interview with a good friend of mine, John Sutras, Word Balloon. That was, I think that was during lockdown, was it? During the days of lockdown, probably.
Yeah.
So the book, Mysterious Travellers, Steve Ditko and the Search for a New Liberal Identity, this came out in 2021, am I correct?
That's right, yeah.
Brilliant. So, have you always been a long-time comic book fan and fan of Steve Ditko, yeah?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, from the time I learned to read, I've been reading comics. There's constantly, even before I was reading comics, my parents were shoving, the book and record sets in my hand and, the Spider-Man picture books and that sort of thing. And I'm of an age where the Secret Wars toys were, first coming out, that first wave of Secret Wars toys, and they all had comics on the back. So I was, learning to read comics that way as I was getting my new action figures and that sort of thing. So yeah, no, it's been a lifelong habit, passion, something.
That's brilliant. There's actually been a couple of reports over in the UK that children now are reading a little less, a lot more screen time, but they find that comics have really brought them out, particularly manga, bringing them out now, reading more. So the UK government at the moment seem to be investing a little bit more into that side of things. Topical as well in the front of the Secret Wars, because at the time recording, Jim Shooter, sadly, who was behind that project, passed away. But it's great to hear from the target demographic that with the project, with the ties as well. So, and then when did you first become aware of Steve Ditko's work? Then it must have been through reprinted material, I suppose.
Yeah, I was pretty young. I was 10, I think about 10, fourth, fifth grade-ish. Marvel was printing those masterwork editions with the silver borders. They were sort of like loss leaders for the master. No, they were Marvel Masterpiece editions, and then they were the loss leaders for the Masterwork collected editions, right? So they were doing the single issues. So I remember, picking up a bunch of those off spinner racks in the comic book store, and I specifically grabbed Amazing Spider-Man #1, of course, because I was a Spider-Man kid, and then a few others. But that first issue of Spider-Man just grabbed me, and because Ditko's Spider-Man, just looked so different and felt so different from the Spider-Mans that I had been reading, for, at that point in my entire life. And it's not as though my 10-year-old brain really understood the nuances or how to appreciate art. I just knew that there was something weird and different about this. And because of that, I was just immediately attracted to it. So I ended up seeking out as much of his stuff, whenever I could. So I was like, oh, I have these Speedball comics. Okay, this is the same guy. I've got this, that, and this. And so from that point, and as I got older and I learned more about it, and learned, actually learned how to collect, insofar as we kind of have to learn how to collect things. I wasn't just grabbing stuff at random. I was, more deliberate in my actions. When I learned how to collect, Ditko was somebody I immediately gravitated towards. He was the first artist that I really knew their name and, wanted and actively sought out their work. And then I picked up other people along the way, of course, but he was the first guy.
Yeah, and it's very similar to my own story when I came across Ditko's work, in that the UK would reprint some comics in Panini. So Panini would have a UK offshoot. They would reprint Spider-Man during the Clone Wars, and I would pick up, they would have an oversized comic, and back then it wouldn't have cost a fortune. It would have been £2 Irish, but then the front would be the Clone Wars, and as a kid I would have been the same, 10, maybe a little bit younger, and you look at it and Kane and stuff is appearing, and I'm like, okay, interesting. But the back was I think it was Amazing Spider-Man 2 with the Vulture. They reprinted, and I said, wow, and I kept gravitating back towards that. And this is something which was written and drawn in the 60s, but it's so colourful, the test tubes, the science, the mechanisms behind it all. It's so, and the fact it was printed in a comic, not a book, having that page physicality to it, no, it is amazing. And isn't it interesting how he spoke across generations? The appeal seemed timeless. There's few projects you can say do that. Some feel dated. So what then led you towards exploring the work of Ditko academically then? So how did this, first of all, what was your trajectory then from being a comic fan to then bringing this into an academic dimension to pursue this and study this and basically make it your career? Because my understanding is the guy who runs an academy teaching people how to make comics, it's tough to break into industry. Now, how to make it as an academic in comics is probably 10 times tougher, I can imagine. So what's the secret origin in that regard?
Yeah, well, the secret origin is the adamantine will of 10,000 Batmans. So, here's the very short version of this, is that I knew from the time I was about 13 that I wanted people to call me doctor. I was like, I need a PhD. I didn't know it. I didn't understand it. I attached myself emotionally to this idea, and I knew that that's something I should do, or I wanted to do. And I did not go down that path right away. I went down a path, to be a teacher, and that wasn't, fulfilling in the way I wanted it to be fulfilling. So I left teaching, primary school teaching and secondary school teaching. And I ended up working at a comic book store called Discount Comic Book Service, which I'm sure people know. They're now, Lunar. So I started working for them in 2004. And while I was there, I was the marketing director. I worked with podcasts. That's how I met our mutual friend, John Suntress, right? We became very, good friends because of my work at DCBS. And, I ran a convention there, and I started working on comics writing projects while I was there too. So, and it got to a point at the store where, the store was going, things were going great for them, but I had grown about as much as I could grow with them, and it was time for me to move on. And, and I was weighing my options and what to do. And, there's no money in comics. So there's a very limited amount of money in comics. And, and I always had that sort of lingering thing in the back of my mind about I do really want to get into the academy and teach the way I want to teach and teach the things I want to teach and teach them the way I think they should be taught. And I didn't want to be sort of hemmed in by the American sort of secondary school system and that sort of thing. There were limitations, right? Mm-hmm. And so I went back. I said, my wife and I talked it over. I got an adjunct teaching gig at a community college to make ends meet. And then I went back and I went to grad school and said, this is what I'm doing. I'm coming here to do comics, to write about comics, to produce comics educational materials, to make comics media, whatever that means. That's what I'm here to do. And I knew that in doing that, I'd been reading Ditko for ages, and I already had sort of intellectual sort of interest in what he was doing before I went back to the academy. And I said, this is what I'm doing. I'm coming back here. I'm doing this thing. Get on board or get out of the way. So that's what I did. And I ended up at Michigan State. And, before I got there, I had written a couple of articles that are, revised for the book. And when I went there and talked to my dissertation advisor, I said, this is a book project. I understand that I'm supposed to be writing a dissertation, but I'm writing a book. And we will work, we're going to treat this as a book. And he said, that's great. That's what we did. So, I spent my time there at all my coursework. I leveraged all of my coursework and all of my seminar papers towards writing this, and made it happen and had it sold, before I had even gotten close to a defense. Mississippi had it up. So that's what happened. And it worked out. And then, and it got nominated for an Eisner, and, things have been going really great with it since then. So that's the short version of the story. Now there's more to this, but that's the short version. I guess the other thing I would add is that, while I was working at DCBS, I was doing marketing stuff, and I was also working with small press publishers that weren't listed in the Diamond Previews catalog at the time. And I had been buying stuff from Robin Snyder for a long time, and Steve Ditko's co-publisher, for folks who don't know. And I reached out to Robin. I said, look, we're the largest, one of the largest stores in the world. Let's get Steve's work listed here. So we were regularly listing his independent work before Robin switched most of it over to Kickstarter. But, we were just selling, dozens and dozens of those. I really worked hard to leverage that platform to get more people interested in what this guy was doing and recognize he's still making new comics right now. He didn't stop working. So I guess my point in that is to say that, as it relates to Ditko, one of the things I've always been interested in with him is the myth versus the man, right? And, and beginning with the myth that he had retired. No, he didn't. He worked every day, and literally until he died. So, those things were just kind of sort of baked into who I was as a comics reader, as someone who was just, passionate about the medium and passionate about this particular artist. And then that was, transformed into what I would do eventually as a critic and an academic.
Well, that's fascinating. And in terms of the department in which you would have studied, like myself, my undergraduate would have been in history. Was this being classified as literature and the arts sort of being where you, into that field, the BA, yeah?
Yeah. So when my initial thought was that, I was going to go to Michigan State.
Mm-hmm.
And my initial thought in going to Michigan State was, one, it was in reasonable proximity to where I'd already lived. So it had been a huge transition for my family. I mean, I was married, I had 2 kids, there's a lot going on, right? When I went back. And Michigan State at the time had like a top tier American studies program, like American cultural studies program. And so I figured, well, I'm going to go here and do American studies, because in American studies, it's just it's not quite a free-for-all, but it allows you to grab a hold of these sort of cultural phenomenons in ways that are not always, that other departments and other programs aren't always friendly toward, let's say, right?
Yeah.
So, I get my application materials out. I knew who I wanted to work with to form my committee and that sort of thing. Well, most of my committee. And then they shuttered the program. So it's this wild, popular and successful program. They're like, nope, we actually don't want to fund that anymore. So I said, okay.
The course of academia, all right. Sounds about how things goes.
Yeah, it's exactly how things go. It was a very useful lesson, right? So anyway, all of the faculty that I wanted to work with were in English. So I said, okay, I guess I'm going to the English department, and that's where I went. And so that's how it worked out. And fortunately, Michigan State is a program, because that's like one of like the 2 places where pop culture studies really starts in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
They were friendlier to a comics project than another department at another institution might have been. So it was just the right place, the right people, the right program.
Yeah, no, it's for me, as I was saying, like my undergraduate was in history, so I was reading this more from like the type of text similar would have been from when I was reading history, but the text itself, it's not a historical text. It's more of a critique, an analysis of the work as well. But I will say this to listeners, like it's worth checking out. Don't feel like it's intimidating. It's not going to feel like a dense homework book. It's very accessible, and for comic book fans, it's a wealth of riches, because you've sourced some amazing artwork and pages that must have taken an immense amount of time. What was the research process for you in conducting the book? Was it through interviews? Did you go to Marvel and DC and Charlton archives? How did that unfold for you?
Well, a lot of it was... So that was the question that, we had to sort of work through as the project began to unfold. And the question was sort of threefold. Like, one is this going to be a biography? And that was a no. Like I did not want to do a biography. I had no interest in doing a biography. So that was out. And those, I think that biographies are, they're often fraught and very often of limited utility. So because they're often so fraught. The other one is this going to be sort of a deep dive, historical sort of archival project? And then the third option is this going to be more of a little bit more distant cultural studies type project? And for what I wanted to do and what I wanted to achieve, the cultural studies approach was more what I was trying to do. So I'm looking just at the primary source texts, and let's figure out what the primary source texts say, and then let's put them in a useful context. So And that inevitably would have involved archival research, right? But just not to the degree that like a historian would be doing. It would be obnoxious for me to say that I do, right? Like that's just out of line, right? So anyway, so we did some archival research, but part of the problem with archival research with Ditko is that the art, it's either stolen or it doesn't exist. So, a lot of these things, when you're trying to look at original pages for someone like Steve Ditko, well, what you end up doing is you have to either track down the art as it exists, like at Heritage or in Comic Art Fans or something like that, find it at a convention, which, twist my arm, make me go to comic book conventions and look for other, or two, get a hold of the limited pages that are available in archives like Ohio State, even Ohio State, and they're still processing, their archive. they only had, I think, maybe 2 pieces from him in that. So a lot of those things are not really, available. I did the work on it. I went to New York there was a Society of Illustrators show that had the very famous, that has the lifting sequence pages, the Mike Burke.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Pages. So, I did my due diligence and went around and found these things. But there's just not a lot there. And while I was writing too, Steve was still alive, and, I had exchanged a few letters with him, but he's also the type of person, and I met him too, but he's the type of person where he's not tight-lipped, isn't the right word, but like he's aware of like when he's getting journalistic questions and he doesn't really respond to journalistic questions. He wants to talk about ideas. He wants to talk about not what he did in the past, but what he's doing right now, like that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some challenges with that as well. And ultimately what it came down to, it was, in deciding how to approach it was, I've got access to the things that I can get access to, but what am I doing? And the thing that I'm doing is I'm trying to sort of upset the apple cart in terms of what people say about this guy. Like, what are they saying was art? Do I agree with this? If I agree with it, fine, but that's not actually helpful. If I disagree with it, then it's just sort of an echo chamber. If I disagree with it, like, how can I demonstrate that there's another way to approach this text, or this sort of series of texts? And that's ultimately what I fell back on. Is like, I've read everything that the man published. I went through all of it, and what is he actually saying? Stan Lee says Steve Ditko's weird. Is he? Everyone says Steve Ditko's an objectivist. Is he? Everyone says that, Ditko's a recluse. Is he? Everyone says that Ditko's conservative. Is he? Right? So, as we start asking those questions, the answers, as they reveal themselves through his work, visually through his work, tell a different story.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt very good about that, not just because I'm, being contrarian or sort of trying to, rewrite the narrative in that way, but I felt good about it because just the preponderance of evidence, not just in the comics themselves, but in his essays that he wrote and the few letters that had emerged online. Like, after he died, there was a whole trove of letters that emerged, but up until the point where, while he was still alive, it was relatively few. So all of those things sort of came together to sort of present this different version of Steve. And I guess the last thing I'll say about this to this particular question is that, like, the choices that I made sort of intellectually were sort of wrapped up in what he tried to do with his work. And there's this, he gives very few interviews, and there's that real famous one where he says, "My work is me." Right? Like, no, I don't talk about myself. My work is me. Now, the fact of the matter is he does talk about himself a lot. He wrote hundreds of pages of essays talking specifically about himself and his ideas. You're talking about yourself, Steve. But he meant it like in the Stan Lee sort of self-aggrandizing type way, obviously. So, if that's true, if we take that at face value and say, all right, this is what he says, what does the work say? This is what I think the work says. And, and I think we've got some pretty sound sort of conclusions about what the work says, and we can demonstrate it over time. And one of the most rewarding things that came out of this was sending a copy to Robin Snyder, and Robin Snyder reading it, who'd worked with Steve for 30 years, and Robin saying, this is it.
That's high praise.
Right. Like, of the number of books and things that are coming out and things that are said about Steve, this is the one.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very humbled by that. Right. And it makes me feel very comfortable about the conclusions that we came to. And, so there it is. I mean, it's a much more complex process. It would end up being a much more complex process than just traditional. I'm going to the archives and trying to bring things together, or I'm looking at primary text and just coming up with an interpretation, or I'm applying this sort of theoretical lens. It couldn't be any of those things. It had to be all of those things.
Yeah. And this goes to show how fertile ground this medium and the art form and your chosen subject matter, in this case, Mr. Ditko, what can be possible when you pull on that thread and explore. I have to confess, we actually do have a Ditko page on display here from the 70s. It's one of his Charlton. I have yet to scan it. I framed, but I haven't scanned it. But what's really interesting about it is It's one of his horror stories with Charlton, and it has a talisman, and you have very much the Ditko hands, but on the talisman you see Spider-Man's eyes. But it's not Spider-Man's eyes, but it's very, as you describe it in the book, Ditkovian. It's an aesthetic, and you can tell that's so much like Ditko's contribution, the way those semi, half moon eyes. It's you can tell without doubt who even the fedoras. There's one character who has a fedora and his face is in shadow. So much of the question of Mr. A in that design that comes through. He is definitely an artist with very distinct that when you see a page you can tell instantly who it is. Robin Snyder, you mentioned. Currently, what's he working with now at the moment? Is he still active within the industry? You said he would have published some of Ditko's later stuff. Is he still active in the comic book publishing field himself?
Yeah. No. Robin, he and Steve worked together for over 30 years. As sort of like a editor and artist duo. And then, as a co-publishing duo. Robin was the editor on all of Steve's later work, later sort of self-published work. So Robin is still doing a newsletter called The Comics.
Very good.
For a long time was sort of the place to get direct information from Steve Ditko. That's where everything was coming out, like a lot of his early essays, his history of, his Marvel and that sort of thing. That's called The Comics, which he still prints. And then he's also been working on a series of reprint editions and they're all available through Amazon. A lot of them are Ditko at Charlton, but he is a big fan of Bob Kanigher. Bob Kanigher work, so he pulls stuff from that and Joe Gill. He wrote Joe Gill, one of the great Charlton writers. So he's still working, doing reprint editions and then running the comics, and is still fairly active.
No, that's pretty.
Certainly as active as someone, of his advanced age, might be.
Yeah. No, it's brilliant. Great to hear. Fantastic. And one of the points you raised there is about basically Steve Ditko the man, Steve Ditko myth. It's very much like, nature pours a vacuum, because Mr. Ditko wasn't as, present with extensive interviews or put him, so he definitely wasn't on social media, so stories were out there. And people just took it as a given. I believe some people may have said it just for the sake of saying, or maybe to, cover a few things historically, but other generations who were far disconnected from it would pick up on this, because there was no counterpoint. Without malice, they just assumed that to be the truth. But as you mentioned, was he a recluse? I can say from my own experience, a couple of years ago, I say a couple of years ago, it's well off of a decade now, but I was doing a magazine for Dublin Comic Con. I think it was the second show, and we had managed to secure an interview with Stan Lee at the time, and the way we arranged it was to through email. I'd call his office, arrange through email. Stan at the time, his eyesight was very, very poor, so he would type in a Word document, and what you would get back would be like the opening scroll from Star Wars in massive font. But I found that very endearing, because I knew it was actually him writing back then without question. And then I thought to myself, well, I wonder if I could, as I've never done. So Foolhall was like, I'm doing an interview with Mr. Ditko. But his address and number was actually listed. You could find. I had actually called him, and at the time I had a very poor phone, and I can imagine my accent as well. But he wasn't dismissive on the phone. We both spoke very briefly. He was simply just right to me, is what he said. Now, in the end, I decided I was at the time without substance of what I wanted to ask him at that point. But then I found out after his passing, many people had come forward to say they had written correspondence, letters, particularly if it was a stamped addressed envelope, he seemed to respond to as well. And this, I found, wow, this is really counted to the idea of, he's this mysterious offshoot character. No, he just seemed to be a normal guy who just did not want to be involved in any type of for want of a better word, a circus. I think he just did his job, happy to do it. Within your correspondence with him, how did you find the back and forth? Was he was he very straightforward in dealings?
Yeah, every time. And I never like crossed a line with him, but like you could tell, right? He's like, okay, like I've given you an answer to this. I'm moving on because I'm not press on with this.
Yeah.
Like I've already done this. Time's ticking. Like I'm not going to keep doing it. So a good example of that is when I asked him about Doctor Strange and whether or not Doctor Strange is Asian.
Yes.
And he writes back and he says, yeah, the answer's in the first issue. Have you not read Strange Tales 110? Right? Like, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that was basically the tone. Like, you know the answer to this. I'm not going to, pursue this kind of reasoning. If you want to talk about ideas, okay, fine. But like, this is a journalistic question about a comic I wrote, at that point, 50 years, prior, right? Like, I'm not going this again. I already told you it's in the art, right? So things like that, like he doesn't suffer fools, right? And the joke I often make about him and about sort of the recluse comment is that, number one, like his office is in Times Square. Like not only is like his address in the book, but he's in Times Square. Yeah. He's not hiding, guys. And number two, like just because someone doesn't want to talk to you personally doesn't make them a recluse, right? Just because someone values their personal space doesn't make them a recluse in that sort of pejorative sense. It just means that maybe they just value their space, right? Or maybe as you point out, and I think you're 100% correct, maybe they don't want to get involved in some circus. Maybe they've seen what goes on in comic stand-up and they are over it, right? Like that is not a recluse. That sounds like sanity, like this is it. So, but my dealings with him, limited as they were always positive and kind. And he was generous with his time, even responding at all.
Yeah, there was a great interview, I think, with the Rolling Stone. I think it was with his family. And yeah, we saw more of the man as well. And he's just that. He goes to show how, silly we are sometimes as fans and we just pick up and take his gospel or a question. But that's what's great when we look. Some people might, tisking when you see a text like this, like I'm based on Steve Ditko, go, well, you're being too serious, we're looking too much into it. I was like, but no, like this is like, first of all, art is so important in defining us as a people and a culture. It's like, it's the moment you start trying to dismiss those side of things is when really something sinister is happening, when you're trying to disconnect people from the art form and from the stories. And the other, it just goes to show how easily, particularly in a day and age of misinformation, how easily we're misled. We just take it for granted. People think now that we're on social media, misinformation is a new idea, but no, it's been around. Like, look at this. People will say something in an interview about someone that's published somewhere and people take it as gospel without any further research. So, having spent over a decade teaching animation and comics and such, like there's always an academic research and critical evaluation module that I used to teach, and students would wonder like, why are we doing this? And it's like, you have to sharpen your skills, because if not, you'll end up building what you want to study, what you want to research on sand, really, And as you mentioned, the Doctor Strange revelation, even though technically it wasn't a revelation, it's pointing out what was always the intent. But to myself and others, because we're so used, you're looking at like Benedict Cumberbatch portraying him on the big screen, and subsequently since the origin, which Stan Lee came in on the origin story, prior to this, Ditko had full reign. And then when you look at the original illustration, it's so clear that yes, Doctor Strange is being depicted as Asian, and what that could have done for representation within the medium, decades ahead of its time. That alone was like, made me pause. And you did a great piece as well. What I found was fantastic about this book was, as I was reading it, it permitted me to go back and look at early Ditko stories with renewed appreciation, such as Norman Osborn. Obviously, one of the other myths that came up is, why did Ditko leave Marvel? And the myth was he and Stan fell out over who should be the Green Goblin. But as you pointed out, Norman was planted so early on. The distinctive hairstyle that we associate in the comics with the Osborns as well was a form of visual communication that when Harry was introduced, that was done with intent. That's brilliant. I love, when something like that is revealed. It's like it's been there the whole time, but when you go back and look at it, it gives a sense of the depth of thought that Ditko gave to his work. And if you really went reaching for it, like, you would be rewarded. Like, if it's up to the reader, he'll put it out there, and then it's up to the reader to kind of engage with it. How did you come across like these? Was this something that was apparent to you? Like, first of all, you got clarification on Doctor Strange, so you must have had an inkling on the representation. And with the Osborn side, was that something which you had already interpreted in your own reading, or is this something which research pointed you in that direction?
I cannot take credit for that. That is Steve. Steve said it. He puts it in his essays when he's writing a history of his time at Marvel.
Yeah,
a series that was cut short. So he's crystal clear about that. And so yeah, I wouldn't take any kind of credit for that at all. That's just pulling out what he said and then putting it into practice and demonstrating, like, he's not making this stuff up. This is not like a false memory after the fact. So no, that's something I got straight from him. But what that taught me, though, is that as I read that from him in that essay, I mean, and I already suspected, I had long suspected the Doctor Strange thing, well before. And in fact, that was like the first letter I wrote him, because I was just like, I have to know, right? So anyway, but what that demonstrated to me between the Doctor Strange thing and then him writing about Norman Osborn in that way is that if he's doing this at this sort of granular level on this series, right, then it stands to reason that he's doing it in other places too. So let's take that hypothesis and put it to the test. Can we observe this anywhere else in his sort of visual oeuvre? And as it turns out, you can, right? And I do that sort of mini case study on the, from his time at Charlton, because they had just sort of Carl Memling's writing the same story over and over, giving it to different artists with just little tweaks. How does this artist draw it? How does Ditko draw it? How does this guy draw it? How does Ditko draw it? And then and if we see something distinct in them, what is distinct in Ditko's? And is that a pattern that we can pull out in other works as well? And as it turns out, yes, you can, right?
Yeah.
So that's was sort of like the impetus, right? That was the catalyst for, like, oh my God, he must be doing this everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And as it turns out, like, and then there's other things we can sort of hypothesize about, and I hypothesize about in the book. One is, about the Ted Kord stories.
Yep.
Those seem to be unused Spider-Man scripts. He did not want to answer that question. It was in the same letter as the Doctor Strange email, or Doctor Strange letter. He didn't say no, but he just didn't want to answer the question.
But in the book, when you see the arts side by side, it is very revealing. Yeah,
it's revealing, to say the least, right? So, but just to be clear, like, he never directly answered that question.
Yeah.
So there's that, but there's also little things too, like characters who don't really have time to get developed, but are definitely there, right? Like, whether it's Mary Jane or Robbie Robertson, or, there's, and I don't really talk about it in the book, but there's this one Black Doctor that appears in both Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. It's the same doctor who takes care of Aunt May, who takes care of Stephen Strange when Strange is, on the outs in New York. Like, he's very clearly planting seeds for these other characters to come back later, because that's what he does. He's always thinking sort of long form, and what can I set up to sort of knock down later. So he's not thinking. I think that's the thing that makes him, one of the things that makes him distinct from a lot of his peers, because a lot of his peers working in the same time, save for maybe Eisner or Jack Kirby, right? Like, they're not thinking long form, right? Like, no, they're thinking Superman's going to punch this dinosaur in this issue, and then the next one, his head's going to be a lion's head, and the one after that, something's going to be tragic with Lois that he has to sort of fix, and then they're just moving on. In this issue, the Flash is fighting Gorilla Grodd because Grodd's going to become the mayor of Central City. And the next one, it's Captain Cold. And they're just thinking, very short form, let's get through these particular issues. And he's not thinking that way at all. He's trying to sort of string together a series of complex ideas that will eventually reveal themselves to the reader. And he's counting on us, right, wrong, or indifferent. He's counting on us as the readers to be able to pick up what he's laying down. He has high expectations for us as readers. And I suspect, and this is just off the top of my head, but I suspect that that's also part of his frustration with a lot of fans, is that they're not paying attention. He's like, you fools, I've laid it all out for you. Why did you believe this cock and bull story about Norman Osborn? Did you not read what I put on the page? Are you sure you're a fan? Are you sure you're a reader of mine? Right? So, those things just kind of, it makes sense that they would eat at him when he's clearly working so hard to sort of lay all of this ground.
What's amazing is his love for the medium and for the characters in the medium, because that comes true in text. As you mentioned, someone doesn't go through that detail if they weren't passionate, because back then, and this is no disrespect to other artists and creators, but some of them, it was very much the blue collar job. They had, mortgages and family support, so they did what they had to do, get it done. But with the likes of, I suppose Kirby to an extent as well, even though he has gone on the record as saying, he did so many pages and stories he did, so he had to, pay the bills at home. But with Ditko, there was always a sense of like he was enamored with this medium. Like I couldn't see himself doing like working in any other field, and I'm sure he's talented enough to be a commercial artist or something else. But this really sung to him. Later texts that have come out, like Jack C. Harris's working with Ditko reveals a Batman pitch he had because he loved the character Batman. To me, it's insane that they didn't. Like Ditko comes in and says, "I want to do Batman," and they don't automatically greenlight that. I'm like, what? It just got to show he was a fan of that character. That was something he would have read growing up himself, and he had ideas. And it's for a lot of people, they might see like he was very, severe, serious artist, but also passionate. I think is a word that doesn't really come up or associate as much with Ditko as it could be. What's really interesting about the text is it's something of a paradox, isn't it? Because it's something which Ditko himself would not have wanted to exist. Like, how did you, in your composition of it and your interaction or correspondence with Mr. Ditko, how did you reconcile the idea of this is a book to which the subject matter would never have wanted to really exist, because he was so adamant about the work speaks for itself? How was that? Did that in any way when you went producing it or colour your approach, or was it just something you accepted and pushed ahead with?
Both. It did weigh on me. It still kind of weighs on me in certain ways, because I know he would hate it. But I mean, I don't think he would hate the ideas, because I think that they are a fair sort of conversation point with his work. So I don't think he would hate what I wrote. I just think he would hate the idea that it was written, because again, it's an outsider who is, acting as an intermediary, not on his behalf, but I think that he would not be out of line in sort of interpreting it that way. Right. So, that's, there's certainly a level of, it's not a violation, but it's certainly something that I'm aware he wouldn't, he would not be, thrilled with. On the other hand, I feel that work like this, whether it's mine or somebody else's or whatever, I mean, just as academics, I mean, what we do, if we do our jobs right and we really know what we're talking about, we are adding to the conversation, and we are sort of, I wouldn't say guiding the conversation, but we are providing context that folks might not otherwise get, or might not have the time or the resources or, the experience to, immediate access to. So, and I think that's important that we do those things. All of us at any level, whether it's as teachers or as, writers or both. So and then, in addition to that, one of the things, and I've said this, to a couple of the Ditko family members as I've, gotten to know them over the past few years, and they're people that I really respect and like, and, they're salt of the earth people. I mean, I think, Steve, they're salt of the earth. But, one of the things I said to a couple of them was like, and they agree, like, but they also feel very similar, like, but, that time has passed, we have to move forward. And in the case that I make to them, I was like, yeah, and we also have to remember that there are great artists and great texts that we only have because someone defied the wishes of the artist. And I'm not saying that that's entirely a defensible, like the most defensible position, but there's no Emily Dickinson if somebody doesn't pull all those poems out of a drawer, right? Yeah. How much Kafka did we lose, right? Or did we gain back, right? And on and on and on. And it doesn't mean that those projects aren't often fraught or they're not questionable or but the alternative is to not have them at all. And I think that for someone like Ditko, who is committed to the idea that the work speaks for itself, as things come forward, whether it's me working on my projects or the family working on their projects, or Jack Harris's book or whatever the case may be, what all of those things do, even though Steve probably would have hated them, what they all do is they give us a clearer picture of this guy that gave us something, right? And without trying to be maudlin or to overstate it, everyone listening to this show is probably listening to this show because of Spider-Man at some level. There's not a single person tuning into this that doesn't know who Spider-Man is. And outside of the reach of this program or any podcast or any comic book store, there are few corners of this globe where Spider-Man is not a recognized, idea.
Yeah.
And because that is true, we know that's true. Because that is true, we have, academics and people who are invested in this have a responsibility to figure out what it means to know who Spider-Man is and to understand what Spider-Man is and why this character speaks to us. Well, as it turns out, we have to understand who this guy is. And what he tells us is something so interesting. And the thing that I talk to students about all the time is because, they've never read Ditko, right? Like,
yeah.
They're probably only marginally aware of him, to be honest. But every one of them, has some sort of association with his ideas. And the example I give them every time is I've got, trying to think of a polite way to say this, I've got mixed feelings about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? Very, very mixed feelings. However, they resonated with an entire generation of people. And if we ask ourselves, what are the things that resonate the most with them? Well, guess what? It comes from the lifting sequence.
Yeah.
Right? Like that moment with Steve Rogers in the alleyway where he says, I can do this all day. That's not Simon. Right? Like that's the lifting sequence. Right? That great moment in the more recent Spider-Man films in the Vulture one, was it No Way Home?
Homecoming,
right? Homecoming, right? What are they trying to recreate? And I think failed to recreate, but what are they trying to recreate? The lifting sequence, right? Makes Peter Parker this hero that we all love. What underwrites the Spider-Verse films, which are the best example of this, right? What underwrites the Spider-Man films or the Spider-Verse films is that Spider-Man works because of who he is inside. It's not his costume. It's not his gadgets. It's not his powers. It's his heart. Can ask where that idea comes from. That idea comes from Steve Ditko. That, full stop. That is his contribution, and he gives us that contribution independent of Stan Lee, right? And he gives us that contribution, and we know so because he and Stan aren't even talking. And that's not just Ditko saying that; that's Stan saying that at the time when that story comes out, right? So, we have to do these things. I think we have a responsibility to it. If this is a cultural artifact that matters to us, we must investigate it. We must interrogate it. We must figure out how this explains us.
No, absolutely. And speaking as a Spider-Man Ditko fan, just a fan of comic book literature and sequential art in general, definitely this book, thanks so much for doing it because it, as I said, it's elevated my appreciation for it. It's given me new insight. And when I invited you to come onto the podcast, I was saying with my students, we've been discussing it as well. It's been used in a couple of different subjects. One was the aforementioned research and critical evaluation subject, because I thought it was great if I could show them something academic, but the topic wasn't as dry as it's a dry academic subject. It might engage them more, even when it comes down to footnote and referencing and such. The other was sequential art design and production. And again, as you were saying, the reading of Ditko's artwork, because this is what sometimes people forget is, for the uninitiated, when it comes to comics, they think it's words and pictures, but it's actually more of a synthesis between the two. And you also have to read the artwork, read the image as much as the words, the text, what is going on. It's a visual medium and communication. This is definitely a work that had to exist. Can't foresee a better version of what you've produced here as well. And prior to it, there had been other writings and texts as well, that existed, but some of it was again leaning too much into hearsay or, it wasn't really substantiated material. This has really helped put, a new, probably perhaps more accurate perspective on things as well. One of them being the idea of objectivism as well, as it was like, this is something which is soon as with Ditko and saying comic book circles so long, people like Ayn Rand and that would be coming in, and this kind of, as you mentioned earlier on in the podcast, The Man in Myth, like, was that exactly as cut and dry as people made it out being? And this idea of the search for a new liberal identity, the one from looking within, as well, that aspect to it, like, fascinating stuff to bring into it. At what point when you began the book did you realize that what had been stated about Ditko and objectivism was perhaps not as cut and dry as it was? Did that stay then the direction? Like, did you always have this title in mind, or did you just know it's going to be Ditko and then the title revealed itself as the research was conducted?
Yeah, the last part first. The title sort of revealed itself, and I have to be, frank. I was bamboozled, into buying that objectivist myth too, because it's so surface level, right? And he certainly gave people, frankly, through his work, gave people reason to sort of run with that, right? So, I was a long time sort of acceptor of that myth until I started doing more of the reading, in the comics, fine, but more reading of his essays and more reading of the sort of short missives that he was writing. And the one that stuck out to me that sort of led to me to really sort of, like, I was suspicious of the objectivist stuff anyway, because of the way that, not just Spider-Man, but like stories like Hawk and Dove, I think doesn't jive. There's things that don't jive there. Doctor Strange, there are things that don't jive there. A lot of his horror stuff, there's things that just don't jive there. So, there was question marks, but then he writes this short piece in one of Robin Snyder's publications where he's taking on some of those myths. He says, people say I'm conservative. Who says that? When did I say this? And then he says the exact same thing about objectivism. Who said I'm an objectivist? Where did you get that information? And I thought, oh shit, right, I should look, right? Because I was just making the connections, like, because I had suffered through enough Ayn Rand, right? to know, like, okay, these are the references, right? Like, I can make this, if I had to make this case, I can make this case, right? But then he writes that, I think it's like maybe, I think it was maybe 2015 or 2016 when he writes that. It's very late. Yeah. And so I start going back, and I'm like, well, where is it? There's only one instance where he says, I'm an objectivist. And there's the very famous Masters of Comic Book Art documentary where he says Mr. A is an objectivist. He doesn't say I, Steve Ditko, and he says Mr. A, right? And that raises questions about, my work is me and so on and so forth. But he also creates a critical distinction there between himself and his characters, right? He's not, exactly, there's not one to one. So then I go back, and there's only one instance of him ever saying that, ever. And it's in the early 1960s in a fanzine, right? For the Violence the Phony issue, the very famous, thing where he is railing against people who are upset about pretend fantasy violence, right? It's mostly about the comics code, but it's about anybody complaining about this. He thinks they're ridiculous, and they probably are. But that's the only time he says it. And then every reprint of that exact same image, he's changed it. He edits out that word, right? And very conspicuously takes that word out. So there's nowhere in print, in his comics, where he identifies himself as having that very particular and peculiar ideology. He's much more complicated than that. That doesn't mean he doesn't like it. He certainly likes it. He gave money to the Atlas Society. He read lots of Nathaniel Branden. He had the Nathaniel Branden books on tape. He's got plenty of stuff from Ayn Rand, right? But the very fact that he's giving money to the Atlas Society and not the Ayn Rand Institute also tells you something about his objectives, that it's much more, it's not a closed circuit for him. It's much more open-ended. So, so he can't be pigeonholed into that one particular ideology. It doesn't mean he doesn't like it. He certainly does. And we shouldn't give him a pass for that. But, like, that's just not the beginning or the end.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the ways I talk about this too with other folks is like, well, like I believe in the golden rule, right? Like I'm convinced that the golden rule is a good rule. I'm not a practicing Christian, right? But I think that rule is very good, right? Like, and you can take any number of other things, any other sort of political parties or whatever. Like, well, I typically vote for this particular party, but I would never, ever in a million years call myself identify myself as a member of that party. Like it just happened to be ideologically expedient. So, like it's much more in line with how most of us behave and how most of us are sort of Velcro beings that sort of just attach these ideas as we are sort of, try to move forward, right? I feel very confident that he believes in, ideological primacy, that his view of the world is shaped by him. And is he borrowing from other people? Yes, but he is reserving the right for himself, pick and choose which of those things he likes. And as a good example of that, in fact, I have them here. I'm not, this is audio, so people won't see this. Listening to it. But we know that he's reading other stuff. I mean, I have in my possession his copy of the Communist Manifesto. He's reading Sartre. He's reading books on Buddhism. He's reading James Randi's, debunking books, right? Like, so he's really sort of, branching out and trying to figure out what pieces work for him. Yeah. And if we call him one thing, right? Like it's not objectivist. He's just, does he like it? Sure. But that's just not even close to the whole story.
Yeah. He's human, it's multifaceted. Sometimes because his association with a character as large as Spider-Man, people think the creator must therefore be as two-dimensional, must be. I said, no, it's like, well, far more complicated. It reminds me quite a bit of another text on a different subject. It was by Padraig O'Meara, and he had written a text called Poison Chalice, which was the history of the Marvel Man, Miracle Man debacle, over, going all the way back from its UK publication to its release in the US. But what came up was the idea of Superman being based on the novel by Philip Gladiator. And for years, this was accepted as the truth, the documented truth. This is it. Of course, the comparison is there. But O'Meara went through extensive research and uncovered there's literally no record, quote, or any otherwise to show that Siegel or Schuster actually read the novel. But this is something that was trying. Then it goes, but as you were saying, it's like, but where does it say? It brings back to the point of like why, when we take an academic lens to something, it can unveil. Now, ironically, a couple of years later, just recently enough, in auction, it came up, a legal letter came to auction, which suggested otherwise, that there might have been the publisher wrote anyway in to say of Gladiator to express something. So there might have been another added dimension. It's crazy what comes up in auctions these days, what paper could come in and unravel everything. But that was, I found, was really interesting. Thus again, we take it for granted, but when you actually sit down, it's painstaking. But this is why academia is there. This is why you do conduct the research. For yourself, Zack, are there any other projects with the work of Ditko that you're currently having development or hope to do in the near future?
Yeah. So I'm going to get to those, but I just want to come back on something I think you said.
Oh, yeah.
That I think is really important, right? That what we do is about identifying nuance and identifying that things are not cut and dry, and that there's always complexity here, and that those layers of complexity are sort of, it's like an onion, right? Like there's just layers and layers and layers to them. And we might get so far and I might get so far, but there's going to come a time when I'm going to be working with the Ditkos and we're going to come across a document and a new layer will be revealed, right? Like something that I couldn't have accounted for and didn't know, right? And the same thing with yours. And that's the process, right? Is to not take anything for granted. You have to look, you have to scrutinize, you have to think complexly, right? So anyway, I just wanted to reinforce that because I just think it's such an important thing to get across, and like how these things come together. It's not just people making stuff up. Like no. We really have to dig. We really have to think, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, I get worked up about that stuff. Anyway, Anyway, so yeah, I've got a couple of different Ditko related projects coming forward. One is a book that I'm writing with Vincent Haddad. We're co-writing a book on the question. There's a series of mini graphs from University Press in Mississippi that focus on individual or underwritten about superheroes. So Vinny and I are working on the question. He's going to work with some of the later stuff, and then I'm going to talk about the Ditko stuff and the late Charlton stuff. And so that's coming out. I hopefully next year, hopefully in 20. We have a deadline for that. I think at the end of 25. So that should be coming forward pretty soon. Additionally, I have a project that I don't think I can name, but I have a comics project that I'm working on.
Oh, great.
With Mike Norton that involves the Ditko estate and Ditko characters, but we have to pause on anything more than that, but it's coming. And then finally, I'm working on a documentary film about Steve Ditko, simply called Ditko, and folks can find out about that at ditko.net is where we've got things, and there's a YouTube channel and social media and that sort of thing too. So on the documentary film, that I was going to write a follow-up to Mysterious Travelers, and then I thought to myself, well, there's got to be a more efficient way to reach people. So can I write this follow-up can I present this follow-up in a 90-minute or 140 or hour and 45-minute film? I think that I can. So, so that's what we're working on, and I've been working really closely with the estate on that. But they've been really wonderful and supportive, and just again, I said it at the top of the show, but just salt of the earth people, and I'm very excited for that to come together. It will be a mix of academic research, interviews, and animation. So it's going to be a fun, I think, really great project.
Well, that sounds brilliant. I look forward to all of that. It's going to be great. I noticed in your background you have a framed Watchmen cover, and this leads you to ask: have you read Tom King's Rorschach? Because I was just curious. Like, that was interesting. You didn't have Ditko in it. He actually had Frank Miller as himself in it, which is interesting. But you didn't have Ditko, but there was a sense of there were not the real Ditko, but like the myth of Ditko as interpreted, almost presented into it. Did you have any? Did you read that story at all? Any thoughts onto that one?
I did read that one, and the thing that I liked about it the most is because I love like the 1970s are like one of my favorite sort of periods in American cinema, because everything's just so bleak and paranoid and downbeat, and just everything sucks and everybody sucks and it's just horrible. I just eat that stuff up. It's like I'm like somebody in the Black Lodge in Twin Peaks. Like that's my Garmin Bozia, right? Like just scooping the cream corn into my mouth. So when I was reading Tom King's Rorschach book, like my first thought was like, oh, he also loves the parallax view because it's just the parallax view. But anyway, so I like the premise of it. I thought it was really interesting. But yeah, he clearly goes in sort of the myth direction with Ditko.
Mm-hmm.
The Hannah Arendt thing I thought was a little. That was an interesting choice, right? Hannah Arendt in this sort of action packed just first comic book series, but anyway, I thought it was interesting enough, but I think it was more the myth than the man.
Yeah, no, absolutely onto it. I think he even had like the main detective was almost like a couple of degrees removed from Columbo,
And he loves Columbo too.
I know, that was it. Yeah.
For whatever it's worth, I also love Columbo. I have multiple Columbo paintings in this paintings of Columbo in this house. So.
It's amazing. I don't know what it is, but in recent years, Columbo has made a massive renaissance for viewers. It's like, thanks to streaming and box sets, people are just, what's old is new again. It's great.
There's a part of me that, so here's my sort of inner Ditko coming out. Like, there's a part of me that loves it because more people are seeing it, but I also grew up watching that show. Like it was in the 70s, stuff was in syndication on A&E. So anytime I was sick at home, I was watching Columbo at home. And then there's the revival from the 80s and up to the 2000s. I just obsessed over all of those, right? And then 20 years after the fact, everybody else gets on board. I'm like, wait a minute, hold on. Like, I've been here. Do not speak to me of the deep magic witch. I was there when it was written, even though I was. It came out 20 years before I was born. But anyway, yeah, I love that stuff. And I'm genuinely glad people are coming to it because it's just so beautiful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Zack, thank you so much for your time. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with an author of a work I always love, and I'm really excited to hear about the upcoming projects and look forward to seeing more from you as well. If folks want to follow what you're doing or get in touch, what would be the best channels to reach you?
Sure. Zack Kruse, that handle on basically all my social media. My link tree is just that, my name at .linktree.com. Everything that you need to know is contained in that one handy page. Thank goodness for Linktree. But yeah, Zack Kruse.
Brilliant. Thank you again so much, Morgan. Thank you. All the best now.
Thank you, Owen.
My thanks again to Dr. Zack Kruse for joining me in this first part of Steve Ditko, Beyond the Myth. Next week, we'll be joined by one of Steve Ditko's long-term collaborators, Jack C. Harris. Mr. Harris will share what it was like working with Steve Ditko and further help provide further dimension to Steve Ditko, the creator. We'll see you again next week. If you enjoyed what you heard here today, please consider liking and subscribing to the Creator in Conversation podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Till next time, this has been a copyright production of Macaulay Consultancy 2025.